Perfect. Well, there's that magic voice. Good afternoon, everybody, and great to see you all for our board meeting today of the Maryland Community Investment Corporation. Today is August 12th at 1 p.m. And we have a lot to get done. The first thing that we're going to do is adopt our meeting minutes from the July 3rd board meeting. The meeting minutes are at the end of your packet. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at them. And I will now entertain a motion. I can't see people. I don't know why, but that's my problem probably. Can I have is there a motion? There we go. Is there a motion to adopt our July 3rd board meeting minutes?
So moved. Secretary Day.
Great. There's a motion. Is there a second? Secretary Flora raised her hand. Great. Okay. All those in favor of adopting those meeting minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Great. Thank you. Meeting minutes are adopted. Awesome. So we have a couple great presentations today. First, we're going to hear from Scott about who is the DHCD Assistant Secretary for Policy. He's going to share a little bit about how the implementation rollout is going, and just update everybody on what's happening and our time through the timeline that we have set. So Scott, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I just wanted to put this slide together and share with the group so you can see a little bit on the arc of the journey that we've been on, and also where today's meeting sits in the bigger context of this implementation journey, and then some of the things that are immediately on the horizon for this group. And there are, many major decision points that remain after this October onward, but just so you all kind of see where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So from April to June, after the signing of the authorizing legislation, DHCD began implementation, and basically in order to prep for the kickoff in the form of the first board meeting. We also did background research and meetings with important external stakeholders and examples. So we met with 2 other Maryland quasis to understand how they do business as a quasi-governmental entity. We met with Medco and MLSC, and then we met with one of the other state-supported community development entities from Pennsylvania, Commonwealth Cornerstone Group, to understand how they operate, what it means to be a state-supported CDE, and some tips and tricks for us as we got started. We also met with a consultant group that the board met last board meeting to understand kind of how they fit into the equation and what the lay of the land looks like. You'll recall, especially also from the minutes that were just adopted, the actions from the July board meeting, electing Comptroller Learman as the first board chair, approving the CEO position description, which had been posted previously, but finalized and considered official and final at the July meeting. We approved the CEO application review and interview designees, and the board authorized filing for the employer identification number and MCIC signatories. In the next panel under August, you can see actions that the implementing staff in consultation with leadership have taken to advance this effort. One important thing to note is that CDFI Fund announced officially that there will be a joint 2024 to 2025 round for a huge combined allocation. Applications will open in early 2025. That means that we could not have picked a better time to be standing up a Maryland community development entity, both because there's more money available and also because there's a delayed application round. So we'll have a longer runway to put in an application for that first round and an increased likelihood of winning an allocation. That's really, really fantastic news. We had sort of read in the tea leaves and alluded to this prior to the first board meeting that folks were saying this might happen. It has happened. The announcement's been official, and that's going to give us a chance for our new CEO to get us in position to put in an application for this first round and a better chance of winning. Also, since last board meeting, we conducted CEO candidate interviews. Thanks to all the agency staff that were involved in the interview panel, in the candidate screening, and in that whole process. We also conducted the reference checks. Our team also, our DFA team, Ken Fick, who's on this call, secured the employer identification number. That unlocks a lot of other possibilities, like applying for, setting up the bank account and a range of other activities. And we also began the 501c4 application. So lots of progress since the last board meeting. On the horizon, besides what's on deck for today, After today's board meeting, we'll have the CEO offer and contracting process. We'll need as a group to determine the CDE's focus areas, whether it includes, an emphasis on housing or manufacturing or job creation. Every CDE has a focus area. That's an important decision that'll be on the horizon. The new CEO should be able to help us move in that direction. We'll also, early on in the CEO's tenure, apply for CDE certification. We'll put out an RFP for the consultant. Almost every new market tax credit application involves a consultant. The point spreads are very, very minimal, and a consultant is really essential for success. We'll go ahead and finalize the process of opening the bank account. We'll fill open board positions, and we'll identify vendors for payroll and accounting, among other functions that the quasi-governmental entity of the MCIC needs to in its existence. So that's kind of where we've been so far, what's happened since we last met, and then the important things that are immediately on the horizon. Were there any questions about things on the to-do list or things that have been accomplished from any of the board members? So this is a good chance for you all to ask the DHCD staff that are implementing any of the processes or outstanding action items, just where they fit in the overall effort. Oh, you're on mute. Comptroller, you're on mute.
Yep, sorry. This is great work. Thank you, Scott. I know it's a little bit like an iceberg. Like, we look all very calm, cool, and collected up here, but like, staff is furiously working so beneath the surface. So really appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions? Secretary Flora.
I just want to commend the staff. I mean, having started up nonprofits and entities before, it's a lot of work. So there is a lot under the surface. So thank you for what you're doing and how fast you're moving on this. It is a tremendous amount of work. So we appreciate everything that's happening. Thank you.
There's about 6 or 7 of us on the DHCD side that have been working on this ongoing implementation work group. So just wanted to thank all the partners from Mark Petroskas from OAG, Haley Lemieux, Sergey, Ken, the whole team over here at DHCD has been tremendous, and it's required expertise from every single one of us to pull together and get this thing off the ground. So great to be part of this team effort.
That's great. And you did mention, consulting with some of the other sort of quasi-governmental agencies that exist, like Medco. And actually specifically about Medco, are there opportunities where we could, I mean, certainly there might be programmatic opportunities in the future where we might be able to work with them. But are there ways that we can like piggyback on them or others that there's not as much work on you all?
So we have been exploring that, and we've, made a couple of asks of them to think through, how we might either, replicate some of their early successes or
Right.
blend some of our, some of the back of the office things like accounting and payroll.
Yeah.
We'll be happy to send you kind of an email download of those kind of behind the scenes conversations where they've gone. I will say they are going through a transition in the next couple of months. From what I understand, they're moving offices or renovating their office.
They're renovating.
So
yeah,
their
they're in our
ability
building. Yeah.
So their ability to partner is somewhat diminished over the
Yep.
next few months, but in the medium and long term, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, especially for, if we need to have an office space, like somebody, even if it's a hoteling space, like, in Baltimore or someplace, it seems like, we should be able to take advantage of some of these other quasi-governmental entities that exist to partner. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. Another place we got a lot out of those conversations was in their bylaws. That's something that we will need to create. I didn't put that on the list here, but that's something we need to create. And they can be pretty generic, but to start with and kind of gain specificity and precision over time. But we have the bylaws from Medco and MLSC that we can use as a template for an initial draft of the MCIC bylaws once the CEO is seated. So they've given us institutional infrastructure like that I think can springboard us forward in our implementation efforts.
That's great. Any other questions for Scott? It's a lot of work. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for the update. That was great. Good graphic. Next, we're going to hear from Tabitha Atkins and from Haley. So Haley is going to kick us off with an overview of New Markets Tax Credit investment in the state. If you'll remember, this was a question that we had in our July meeting, like, where have these tax credits gone? And so she's going to talk to us about that. And then we're going to hear from Tabitha, who's a consultant with Cross Street Partners, and Cross Street Partners does a ton of new market tax credit work. And so she's going to really talk to us about their work and what they've seen, what's worked, what hasn't. So first we'll turn it over to Haley at DHCD. Thanks, Haley.
Thanks, Comptroller. I just have a couple quick slides, and I do want to start by acknowledging our work study student, Morgan O'Connell, who was responsible for a lot of the data collection and organization on this. So I really appreciate her time on this. Yeah, as Comptroller Lerman mentioned, a request from the first board meeting was to cover how and where new market tax credits have been used in Maryland. So first to start, this map shows in gray the qualified new market tax credit areas. So this is where you can make new market tax credit investments, overlaid with an orange overlay for sustainable communities. Sustainable communities restrict a lot of DHCD community development programs and generally reflects long policy history of where the state has decided to make concentrated reinvestment and to make development investment decisions. So overall, there's really a lot of overlap between the two designations. I can share also that to be eligible for the qualified new market tax credit areas, there are two factors that are considered in the authorizing statute for federal new market tax credits. So first, the census tract needs to have a poverty rate of at least 20%. And second, there are income criteria. So if the tract is located within a metro area, the median family income for the tracts cannot exceed 80% of the statewide median family income. And if the tract is located within a non-metropolitan area, the median income can exceed the either the statewide median or the metro area median. So that's part of why you see more larger rural tracts included, where that's part of the new market tax credit framing, and also as an opportunity for more investment in rural areas that other DHCD programming may not capture. About 77% of all new market tax credit projects that we were able to identify have occurred in the city of Baltimore. And talking to stakeholders on this, I think there's a couple different theories on why this is. First, there is a large need in Baltimore City, and Baltimore City has both a higher density of nonprofits and mission-oriented projects to do this work. And second, prior to the establishment of the MCIC, there hasn't been a CDE with a dedicated Maryland statewide focus to really identify the opportunities that exist outside of Baltimore, or otherwise build a wider ecosystem of projects outside of Baltimore, where that's an area where this entity will have a key advantage to spread those resources further across the state and create more conversations with community members. And finally, this chart shows what kinds of projects new market tax credits have been invested in. This compares Maryland in blue chart and the blue graphs to national in the orange bars. And you'll notice a few key differences between nationally how the program has been invested to how the program has been utilized thus far in Maryland. So first, I should acknowledge off the bat that there are some national categories that aren't reflected on this chart at all for space. So about 13% of new markets have been invested in other CDEs, in forest, agricultural, mining and quarry, in energy, and in hotels. And we thus far have not identified any new market tax credit projects in Maryland in any of those sectors. The second thing that's worth noting is that there are some areas where there has been a larger investment in Maryland relative to nationwide. So we've had a lot of investment in office and professional services, and this includes scientific research, engineering services, and notably nonprofit incubation. So we have a lot of nonprofit incubation projects that have been invested in new market tax credits. And the second category where we've had a lot more investment is services for vulnerable populations, which does include, for example, addiction treatment facilities, employment services facilities, and vocational training facilities, where that's also an area where we've had a lot of concentrated new market activity in Maryland. Secretary Flora, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. Just a couple of clarifying questions. What time frame does this reflect? And when it says allocations, does that mean that the projects have actually been built? Or can you tell us a little bit more around some of the qualifiers under what ends up on this chart? That would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. So for the Maryland data, it is, we looked only at completed projects, and that includes from the beginning of the program in early 2000 to the latest project we identified actually was completed in 2024. So we identified about, I think, a total of 53 projects in Maryland. So this is inclusive of those projects we were able to identify. It may not be comprehensive. There may be projects that we're missing. And new market tax credit allocation refers to the total allocation of federal funding in the project. So if it received an 8 million new market tax credit allocation from 3 different CDEs, that's what's reflected in as a share of the total. I think the total for all 50 projects was a little over $540 million in allocation.
Great. This is really interesting.
And that's it from me. If there's no further questions, I'm happy to turn it to Tabitha.
Any other questions or comments or other data that folks would like to see? Okay. Interesting. Great. Tabitha, thanks for joining us today and lending your expertise and telling us in a few minutes what you've been learning for many years.
Sure. And Haley, will you put my presentation up or should I just do it? I didn't.
I'm happy to pull it up.
right.
Give me one moment.
All right.
Tabitha, I'm curious before you start while Haley's doing that, if you have any thoughts on that chart that you just had up and how like we are so different than national on the office and professional services. Was that surprising? I mean, you probably know that already, but I'm just, any thoughts on that?
No, that is not surprising at all. When you think about the concentration of the universities here, specifically in Baltimore, a lot of allocation has benefited the bioparks, whether that's the University of Maryland Biopark, whether that's the EBDI Biopark, and then a lot of the other commercial real estate development projects in between. So yeah, that one statistic was not surprising at all.
Interesting. That's good. Good to think about what kinds of projects, right?
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. I am Tabitha Atkins. I'm delighted to be before the board to talk about new market tax credits in general, but more specifically, the activity that has occurred in the state of Maryland. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in the new market tax credit industry since the very first round of the program, so I'm kind of aging myself. And I've sat on different sides of the table. That's the best analogy that I could give. Started off at the CDFI fund. I've worked for a couple of CDEs, including City First Bank of DC, National Trust Community Investment Corporation, and most recently, Urban Action Community Development, which is a subsidiary of Cross Street Partners. In my role also at Cross Street, I also work specifically on engagements for nonprofits as well as Cross Street to secure new markets for their respective projects. The only side of the table that I have not sat on has been that of the investor, but the day is still young. So I give a really, I think, a well-rounded perspective on the program and specifically around deal selection. So if we can go to the next slide. I always liked I really enjoy kind of doing these presentations. And I always start with this very first slide. And it's a refresher to you all since you have started to go through this process. But I always go back to what was the original intent of the program. And I'm a student of policy. Policy is my background. And the new market tax credits program was either the or one of the last pieces of legislation that former President Bill Clinton passed. And it was really looking at ways in which to get Wall Street to see value in historically under-resourced communities. And for their investment, they're incentivized through the tax credit. And so I always go back to that intent as we're looking at deals and projects that have benefited from this program. Go to the next slide. And so, Haley showed that chart of activity for nationally, then also in the state of Maryland. But I really wanted to just kind of quickly highlight what does that mean from a project perspective. We understand that regardless of who gets allocation, so we know that the next round of allocation of that $5 billion of authority will be announced in September, October. But regardless of who makes that list of 100, there are specific asset classes that will always be in vogue and will always be important, to the industry. And so as on Haley's chart, you saw that healthcare is always going to be important. Healthy foods, specifically grocery stores and food banks, will always be important. Operating businesses that are huge employers of quality jobs will always be important. Nonprofit sponsored projects, whether that is a charter school or a homeless facility, will always be important. And then going, Brooke, to your question around the office space, commercial real estate has historically been important because you can aggregate a lot of really strong employers in one location to really move the needle, in community. Projects really vary in size, depending on not only the asset class and total development type, but then that also leads to how much allocation a project can secure. And I always tell prospective projects that you can't get more allocation than the size of your project or your basis, but you can get less, right? And that's really based on availability of allocation. But on average, projects secure about 8 to 10 million of allocation. Most projects will have about 1 to 3 CDEs. And on average, a CDE will provide a project about 5 to 10 million of allocation. Because CDEs are not a monolith, you have some CDEs that only do commercial real estate transactions, some only do operating businesses. And so we are seeing that from a structuring perspective, some CDEs may only want some of their allocation to support certain facets of your deal. And so things can get a little complicated or tricky there. But one of the things that I'm really love is that for those CDEs that are also lending institutions, they also like to sit on different sides of the table as well. And so for a CDE that gets allocation, that's also a lender, it actually improves the probability of them supporting your project if they're also providing the debt. And then going back to the intent of the program is to incentivize investors. 99% of projects will have one investor, but I have worked on transactions really like in the health manufacturing space where we are seeing projects that may have 2 investors. And there's different reasons why that happens, but 99% of projects that we've done will have a single investor. Go to the next slide. So one of the big trade associations for our industry is the New Market Tax Credit Coalition. And in addition to the advocacy work that they do, they also like to aggregate data from not only their members, but then also from the CDFI fund, looking at activity on a state basis, which then becomes a really great advocacy tool. to ensure that the program continues and then eventually will become permanent. In one of their last fact sheets that's on their website, they looked at over the last 20 years, what's been the activity in Maryland. Some of this is self-reported from CDEs, and then some of this is juxtaposed to the CDFI funds report. But what they've shown is that there have been 115 projects in the state of Maryland that has received allocation. Some of that is a mix of commercial real estate, healthcare projects, and manufacturing endeavors. Of those 115 projects, that's resulted in $4.2 billion of financing activity. But then going back to the intent of improving quality of life, those projects have created over 15,000 permanent jobs and 24,000 construction jobs. So if we go to the next slide, you know, my current hat is really around consulting, specifically project-related consulting. And one of the questions I always get from projects is kind of, what is this secret sauce? And what makes a project not only eligible for allocation, and we've already talked about the eligibility, but really what makes a project not only attractive to CDEs to secure allocation, but then most importantly, how do you get your deal closed? And I kind of was thinking about this and I'm like, oh, it's really wrapped in 4 pillars. And that first pillar is, what problem or issue is your organization trying to solve, and are going to use new market tax credits to do that. So for example, if you're a healthcare facility, you want to add more beds for patients or add a dental practice. If you are an operating business, you want to employ more jobs, create more jobs. So really, what is the story that you're trying to tell? Your story is, what I like to say is that if you're on a dating app, you want someone to swipe on your picture, your story is what's going to get CDE's attention. Once they have your attention, then the rest becomes a standard transaction that you would endure whether or not you were doing new markets. And so when we get into that second pillar, it is looking at, what is the size of your project? And do you have the ability to raise capital for that project? One thing to note is that new market tax credits are only going to represent up to 20% of your capital stack. New markets are the last money in. So you need to show that your project has raised that other 80% of capital. And that's where things can either elongate your timeline or what have you. So that's the first big thing. Do you have a balanced budget? The other is really looking at you as an organization and making sure that you have the capacity to execute on your story. Looking at your staff, looking at your balance sheet, looking at your track record. And then that fourth pillar is, who's the team that you've put together to bring your project to life? And your team could be everything from your architect to your general contractor. Do you have an owner's rep? Have you hired a fundraising consultant? Who are your external programmatic partners? When all 4 of these pillars are aligned, I will say that it definitely increases the chances of your project getting allocation, but more specifically, being able to close on that financing. Let's go to the next slide. So before, I want to highlight a couple of recent projects that I've worked on. As I mentioned, I've sat on every side of the table except that from an investor. So all of these projects except the last one I've worked on directly. But before I talk about, those projects, I definitely want to give a nod to the first CDE, and I don't know, I doubt if anyone from this organization is on the line, but the very first CDE to close on new market tax credits was the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. They're a CDE that specializes in doing historic adaptive reuse projects. If I'm not mistaken, they were the first CDE to close on a Maryland project, and specifically in Baltimore. And so if you kind of look downtown, the Hippodrome Theater was a new market tax credit project that they did. American Brewery was another new market tax credit project that they did, as well as a couple of others, downtown. And I just wanted to give them a little bit of a nod. But as we're going through these couple of projects, I wanted to show a few in different asset classes. The first of which is education. The reason why I'm highlighting the Mother Mary Lang Community School, which is right off of MLK Avenue in West Baltimore, is historically charter schools are the asset class in education that gets new market tax credits. Mother Mary Lang is a private Catholic school. And what was so amazing about this project was that this is a merger of two existing schools into one location. I think those schools had some delayed maintenance and other challenges. And so these kids really deserved a new school. Mother Mary Lang is a 65,000 square foot school that at full capacity will serve 520 kids from grades pre-K up through the 8th grade. 60% of those kids qualify for tuition assistance, free and reduced lunch. And the curriculum is really focused on STEM education. When we're thinking about what makes this project special, it was going back to proximity to other institutions. And so this project is very close to the University of Maryland Biopark. And the Biopark actually entered into partnerships with the school around doing workforce development for teachers and really cool internships and programs with the students. This project secured 17 million of new market tax credits from Harbor Bank and UACD, and US Bank was the investor on this transaction. You can go to the next slide. So going from education, I really wanted to highlight workforce development, and we're still in West Baltimore. This was a project where I was the new markets consultant on this transaction. We worked with an organization called Paul's Place. Paul's Place provides wraparound services for very vulnerable families, everything from assistance around food insecurity, financial literacy, and everything in between. After the civil unrest that occurred in the city in 2015, the former executive director, Bill McClennan, really wanted to help solve for the issues around employability and making sure that that residents, regardless of age, had access to employability. And one of the things that he realized was that the hospitality and food services industries were the most forgiving industries as it related to individuals with challenges. And so the concept of Groundworks came about. And so Groundworks at its core is a culinary arts training program that is set up using a cohort model. And so the participants receive Safe Serve certification. So they understand how restaurants work from the front of the house to the back of the house. And once they complete the program, they are then placed in permanent employment, whether that's in a restaurant or a hospitality industry. But one thing that made this project unique was that Paul's Place also created a social enterprise restaurant that included a catering service, a restaurant that was open for lunch and for dinner. And so for the individuals that were going through the culinary arts program, they got on-the-job training through the restaurant. And so we were able to get $10.5 million of allocation from 2 non-Maryland-based CDEs. And I just wanted to point this out. Scenair CDE is based in, I think, either Michigan or Minnesota, one of the M's. And then Community Builders is out of Boston. This was a deal that we did with JP Morgan Chase Bank. And it's one of my favorites. And when we finished this project, it was recognized as a New Markets Project of the Year through Novogradac, which is one of the big accounting firms for our industry. If you go to the next slide. We're still in West Baltimore. Another really great project that we worked on in a consulting capacity was with Beloved Community Services Corporation. This project was actually the redevelopment of the elementary school that Justice Thurgood Marshall attended. Beloved Community Services Corporation took on the helm of this project, and they did it in partnership with the University of Maryland's Judge Alexander Williams Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. And that partnership really helped to get this project, off the ground. Other tenants for the project includes the Billie Holiday Center for Liberal Arts, the University of Maryland's Mini Medical School, as well as a partnership with BWI Airport. One of the things that makes this project unique is, as you all know, doing historic tax credit, doing adaptive reuse projects requires a lot of subsidy. And so this is a project that had both, in addition to the new market tax credits, it had federal and state historic tax credits, a lot of support from the state of Maryland in terms of grants, as well as philanthropic support. And so we were able to get a little under 10 million of allocation from the reinvestment fund, and US Bank served as not only the investor for the deal, but then they also put some allocation into the transaction as well. This project will be catalytic because it is creating a new cultural destination in West Baltimore. So this was really amazing. If we go to the next slide, I also wanted to highlight another. Oh, sorry.
Just very briefly, I just wanted to flag we have about 5 minutes left.
Oh, I'm almost done.
Yeah,
I'm almost done. The next project to highlight is another historic adaptive reuse deal. This one's down in Cambridge, Maryland. The reason why I wanted to highlight this is because historically, rural projects that get allocation are usually manufacturing projects and healthcare deals. This is a commercial real estate deal taken on by Cross Street Partners that was really focused on serving the aquaculture industry down on the Eastern Shore. We were able to get a little over 31 million of allocation from several different CDEs. US Bank was the investor. And this, similar to the Thurgood Marshall Center, this one had, I think, almost 20 different sources of capital. So it was very complex. But this is one that really serves as a reminder that you can do commercial real estate in rural markets. And then the next project that we have is an operating business project that recently closed on allocation this year. It's with a tech company that was looking for allocation to really build their internal infrastructure. So for working capital, for additional capital to support training and infrastructure. And so the Fearless Tech was able to get 8 million of allocation from another Boston-based CDE called Arcteris. And Dudley Ventures, through their parent company, Valley National Bank, served as the investor. This project is unique. I just want to highlight that this project received $2 million loan from the Department of Commerce through the State Small Business Credit Initiative. So that was really, really great. And as a result of the New Markets investment, they were able to create and retain about 50 jobs. And so the last slide that I have is really encapsulates that, again, going back to New Markets is the last money in, and it's only going to represent up to 20% of your capital stack. And so all of these projects needed amazing financing partners to bring their visions to life. And so we know who our federal partners are, but I also want to highlight all of these deals that we worked on included grants from the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development, or state historic tax credits that got approved through the Maryland Historical Trust. All of these deals included either permanent financing or bridge loans from the Neighborhood Impact Investment Fund, from the Reinvestment Fund, from Enterprise, from Baltimore Community Lending. And I just wanted to show that none of these deals are done in a vacuum, that it takes really great partners to bring these deals to life, and then also be able to attract those national dollars into the state of Maryland. So I will stop there. Okay.
That was great. That was really helpful. Oops, can you guys hear me? There, I'm unfrozen. That was great and really helpful. Secretary Day.
Comptroller, thank you so much. Sorry, my finger slipped and my hand went up faster. I didn't mean to cut you off. But Tabitha, I had two questions for you. So you mentioned the SSBCI investment, but earlier in the presentation, when you talked about how CDFIs are often the lender as well as the CDE, as well as the contributor. In our case, at least for, speaking for one agency, we may be able to be in a position as a lender, even though the MCIC is not within the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. I assume nothing would prevent us from continuing to be involved through whether it's our business lending like SSBCI or other lending tools such as our bond financing or subordinate debt or low-income housing tax credits if we were talking about a housing project.
Yeah, it's always a lot easier when you can control the amount of financing parties in a transaction. And so if the state has lending tools that could work in a new market tax credit transaction, we're definitely all for it, and we would welcome it. The thing is just making sure that the regulations and the rules for each of those lending facilities can work well with the new markets, in a new market structure.
Are there any conflicts that you would see between those lending facilities and a new market structure?
None that I could think of offhand, other than you mentioned LIHTC. You can't use in the same financing structure low-income housing tax credits and new market tax credits. So those don't work in the same structure. However, if your project is a mixed-use deal that involves LIHTC, you would have to use two different financing structures. So the two structures don't touch. So that adds a bit of complexity. That's the only thing offhand that I could think of.
Sure. And that only represents one portion of our housing finance. We have other tools as well. The last question I have on this is you mentioned that most of the deals that you were discussing had bridge financing on the last slide from one of those entities like NIF, BCL, or others. How much of a barrier, with your experience in new markets tax credit deal, how much of a barrier is the limitations around availability of capital for bridge financing? Is that an area where additional resources are needed or additional exploration of creating new tools is needed?
I would even go back before you get to needing bridge capital. Unfortunately, a lot of deals don't move forward because they don't have pre-development funds, unfortunately. And so, once a project can get over the pre-development hurdle, and they have a very robust capital campaign strategy, and we know that all of those funds aren't available on day one, that's when we go to our lending partners like NIF and the Reinvestment Fund and others. They're coming into bridge capital campaigns, which is amazing. Because a lot of the traditional banks don't do that. So having a CDFI partner that understands new markets, is absolutely amazing. But the more that we can have lending partners that could assume a little bit more risk outside of the capital campaign, especially for those projects that may have a budget bust and may need some, permanent debt in order to balance their budget. Having other lending partners that would assume some of that risk would be amazing. And so I'll put a plug in if the state of Maryland wants to come in and be that risk-based lender for deals. we definitely welcome it. There will definitely be demand for that lending product.
I just want to make sure, Haley and Scott, you heard the first part of Tabitha's answer. Speaks directly to the conversation we were having earlier today. What a timely conversation.
Good questions. Tabitha, one thing that we haven't talked about, and the information you provided was really helpful along with Haley's, is the number of projects that don't get new markets tax credits, whether it's because there isn't a CDE that is willing to take them on, right? There's sort of multiple levels of potential rejection. One is the CDE is not willing to sort of add them to their portfolio, or second is the CDE tries, but then there's no award. Getting funded, but actually it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket in terms of who applies. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll put on my CDE hat. You know, when the awards list comes out, there's 100 or so groups that are on that award that gets awards. A handful of those groups are national. A lot of them are regional, hyper-local, or multi-state. In the state of Maryland specifically, there are 5 Maryland-based CDEs, but there's only one of those CDEs that have more of a regional footprint. And so as a result of that, every deal in Maryland specifically has to compete nationally, for allocation. And so once you open up that bucket nationally, I always advise my clients is that the success rate is about 20%, because you are having to compete nationally. And so that's where that story really comes into play, because you want folks to swipe left or right. I don't know which way you're supposed to swipe to show that that you like each other. Mm-hmm. But the probability is increased if there is a hyper-local, hyperactive group that has Baltimore or the state of Maryland as a priority, and then the field is not as crowded. I mean, when I was at the CDE, we would get inundated with probably 100 or so requests for our allocation. And as I mentioned, on average, CDEs are putting 5 to 10 million of allocation per project. So at max, you're doing 5 deals. But you have a request for 100 or so projects, and maybe 20 of those are viable, right? So it's very, very competitive, very competitive.
Thanks. That's really helpful, and thanks shows why we exist.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Any other questions or comments? This is a great presentation. Super, really helpful to see different examples within each of the categories too. No? Seems like we might be letting you off the hook then, Tabitha. Yeah. Awesome. Well, great. Thanks so much for joining us. Tabitha, that was really helpful and interesting. Now we're going to turn it over to Ken, who's going to present on advances on rolling out the architecture needed to set up the MCIC. What's been set up so far, what's left to do. So looking forward to it, especially as a comptroller. I appreciate, this is what we do for the state. So I appreciate you, Ken, your work in helping set this up. So we start on a solid footing. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So yeah, we set up the EIN. I'm working with Wells Fargo, the state's bank, obviously, to set up a separate checking account as well, too, in order so we can run payroll and set up the back office support. What we're looking for in this particular slide is permission to go forward with the outsourced controller position or part-time controller to set up QuickBooks, set up the AP platform, develop the policy and procedures and the internal controls and the monthly reporting packages to all of you, and the formal month-end close process. And then ongoing every month, transaction processing, bank recs, and so on, In addition, we'll have to follow Form 990, which will just need support for that as well too. And we'll need an annual audit, which this person will help as well too. There'll be an initial grant or new NMTC track as needed and forecasting budgeting as needed, going forward from there. Anticipating to be quite light or not as expensive in the beginning. I mean, if we have simply the CEO and maybe 1 or 2 transactions, but as that progresses and more people join, the cost of this will grow as well too, which is intended to do. So I'm looking at several variable. I have 3 proposals right now that I'm looking at that'll be reviewed and determine what is the best action to move forward. Happy to answer any questions you all have.
Sorry, Comptroller Lerman, you're on mute.
Oh, didn't know you were talking.
Sorry, I put myself on mute when you're talking, so it's not loud here, but I know I think I did see that there were a few options out there that you're sort of pricing out and figuring out. So thanks for sharing that.
Correct. And then also for the CEO, we have several options there as well too, including even bringing them on as a DHCD employee and then transferring them over. It's really timing. The idea was to move them really to keep it separate, right? And if I can keep the payroll, keep the balance over there and bring them on directly in the MCIC, but working with the Treasury Office and so on, the state, to make sure that we're following all the rules.
Okay, great.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you need anything from our central payroll team, just let us know.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks, Ken. Okay, we have a few different items now to go through. So if you want to take down the PowerPoint for a minute, I think we probably don't need it just to go through the motions, just so we can see everybody. Thanks. So we have a few different action items we need to review, and these are in your agendas. The first is this motion to authorize the opening and establishment of a bank account. And this, of course, is important to establish legal authority and accountability, financial management and control, and transparency. So we need a checking account. For those of you who remember opening a checking account. And of course, this will be for paying only authorized expenses, including payroll for the CEO and administrative costs. Right now, the budget, as I understand it, lives within DHCD, and Haley will, or Ken, you will correct me if I'm wrong, you're planning to transfer it out at some point. So need this bank account to be able to do that. So is there a motion to open a banking and establish a bank account?
Move.
I see Secretary Day made a motion and Secretary Flora is seconding. Is there any questions for Ken or any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, great. You just keep yourselves unmute for the next few moments and minutes as we are going through motions. Okay, any opposed? Great, the ayes have it. We will move forward with the bank account. Next is we need staff counsel for the Maryland State Ethics Commission. And so this is a motion to designate Catherine Thompson. She is staff counsel for the Maryland State Ethics Commission to receive ethics complaints concerning board members, officers, and staff. So HB 599 requires that there be an ethics liaison to ensure compliance with all of our state ethics regulations, to promote transparency, and to help provide oversight and guidance on ethics matters. So if anybody has any questions about board ethics, she would be the person to talk to if we pass this. So is there a motion to designate Catherine Thompson to handle our ethics matters?
So moved.
Okay, is there a second? Secretary Chaudhry is seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Congratulations, Catherine. Next, we need to authorize DHCD on behalf of the MCIC to contract with a part-time controller for payroll and other related services. So as Ken just noted, this will help establish efficiency, internal controls, accountability, and support compliance reporting. Do we have a motion to authorize DHCD to do this?
Motion.
Secretary Flores moved. Is there a second? Secretary Chaudhry, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Great. Next up, we need to temporarily, we need another motion to authorize DHCD to help us with back-end matters. This is to temporarily contract with the CEO as an independent contractor if the CEO prefers a start date that is more than 2 weeks later than when a controller could be onboarded. So this is really just about flexibility in hiring a CEO. Contractors can start immediately, ensuring that we'd be able to move forward with the CD application. As we know, there's a tight timeline, even though it's pushed out a little bit, it's still tight. So do we want to authorize DHCD to do that? If so, is there a motion to do so? So moved by Secretary Chaudhry. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, there's a second by Secretary Flora. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. And a little more work for DHCD. We need to authorize DHCD on behalf of MCIC to purchase IT, hardware, software, laptops, phone software, and related products for MCIC and its employees to operate. Is there a motion to authorize DHCD to do this? Okay, Secretary Flora, is there a second? Secretary Chaudhry, thank you very much. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. Great. So that was much of the work in open session. Now I'm gonna look for a motion to move the board meeting to a closed session in accordance with the general provisions article section 3-305B1 to go into a closed session to discuss the appointments and qualifications of candidates for the CEO position. The closed session is necessary to protect the privacy of the candidates and consider their qualifications, which is permitted under the personnel matters exemption. Is there a motion to move into closed session?
So moved.
Is there a second? There's a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we will stop now and go into closed session.
So we'll all hop off and join the other link that's in your calendar invite.
Oh, there's another link in my calendar. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, should have said that.
Okay.
Sorry.
So to avoid any risk of overlap or confusion, there's
Got
a
it.
completely separate link that we'll all jump onto now.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
It's
is
a
it a
calendar
Google?
appointment.
It's a Google Meet. Okay, got it.
Do we
Nice.
adjourn or
Google.
anything first before we have to go to?
No, we adjourned, so we're here, and then we will have to come back to open session
Right.
after this to close the meeting. Yep.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
No.
See you in the other link.
Yep. Great. Okay, looks like we have everybody. Okay. We are back in open session of this August 12th meeting. We adjourned our closed session where we discussed personnel matters. I think the only thing left to do now, let's just make sure, does everybody know, do we know when our next meeting is? Is that on the calendar?
For September 3rd at 1 p.m.
September 3rd at 1 p.m. Great. And I think any other matters? Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. That's it. Meeting adjourned. Have a great afternoon. I'll see